Welcome to JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at UNC Chapel Hill and the co-host of JAT Chat. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Rachel Meyers and Dr. David Howell. Dr. Meyers is a sports physical therapist at Children's Hospital, Colorado, and Dr. Howell is an associate professor of orthopedics at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. They are authors of Adolescent Female Athletes with Menstrual Dysfunction Report Worse Sleep and Stress Than Those Without Menstrual Dysfunction, published in the Journal of Athletic Training. Rachel and David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So starting off with a very broad question for our listeners. What is menstrual dysfunction and why is it important to consider with our adolescent female athletes?
Yeah, that's a great question. First off, it's not normal for girls to lose their period. Menstrual dysfunction is just not normal. I remember when I was a high school female athlete, I used to think that if you lost your period, you were considered an elite athlete, which is just not true. We define menstrual dysfunction as three kind of main components. The first one is not having a period by the age of 15 or having your first period after age 15. The second one was going 3 or more consecutive months without a period. And then the last kind of criteria that we used was having 9 or fewer periods in the last 12 months. And it's important because menstrual dysfunction can be a signal for other underlying health conditions, which can affect, long-term health and well-being for our female adolescent athletes. It can also lead to, more potential bone stress injuries down the road or poor performance and other things that we just really have to take into consideration. And one of the big kind of things that we found in our study was we found a prevalence of 25% of our female adolescent athletes had menstrual dysfunction, which is pretty high. And I think that's just really important that this topic shouldn't be taboo and that we need to discuss it and talk about it and make this common for our healthcare professionals to bring up.
25%, that is a large number. So I appreciate you sharing that information with us. What prompted that exploration about how menstrual dysfunction may influence some lifestyle factors like sleep and stress in these adolescent female athletes?
So most of the research out there really focuses on prevalence of menstrual dysfunction or risk factors, but not a lot is out there on how menstrual dysfunction affects quality of life. So that's really kind of what prompted us to study this. Adolescence is also a very important time in a lot of people's lives. And it's important to really understand different associations that can be associated with menstrual dysfunction to help, make our clinical practice better and just make health and wellness better for these girls.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that a little bit, I think that to Rachel's point, this shouldn't be something that we shy away from. I think that it's a critical health indicator that could mean a lot of different things. But as Dr. Armento, one of our colleagues and one of the I think the senior author on this paper likes to point out is like in many ways, it's a vital sign. It's not going to tell you something specific about an underlying health issue on its own, but it can be an indicator of some sort of physiologic, biologic, or other problem that exists. And to Rachel's point, in the context of adolescent athletes, there is so much going on in life and there's so much change and there's so much lack of familiarity about your own body and your awareness, as well as some of the social changes and the neurodevelopmental changes and all the stresses, right? It becomes a very hard thing for us to know what exactly is going on until we actually ask the questions. And so really that I think drove a lot of the integration of why we included this as an aspect, or I guess a grouping variable in our study.
I really appreciate that commentary on it serving as a vital sign. And in the previous questions, you also have already alluded to additional conditions that we need to be concerned about when we're thinking about menstrual dysfunction. Can you just elaborate a little bit more there on what are some of the additional conditions that we maybe need to consider when we're thinking about menstrual dysfunction in our adolescent athletes?
Yeah. So low energy availability is definitely a very big one, which is, similar to the relative energy deficiency in sport. They also have to, look into primary ovarian insufficiency and stuff like that we just have to be a little bit more aware of.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also this concept of, again, energy availability being closely tied to a lot of different things. If you think about the relative energy deficiency syndrome wheel, or in sport wheel, excuse me, and the ability to have some sort of like actionable outcome from this, right? Like it's not enough to say, hey, you have menstrual dysfunction. What do you do with that information? In the context of what like Rachel brought up here is understanding the way in which, we're educating our athletes, the way that we're screening athletes, during a preseason evaluation. You can screen for this, but what do you do with that? Well, what are your eating habits? What are your sleeping habits? What are your training habits, right? And what is your own kind of motivation, your own body composition look like? What are the things that we need to help you be successful? And what are the myths that we can bust during the preseason to help you understand how your body should function, despite maybe what, to Rachel's original point about being a high school athlete and what a coach might tell you, what your peers might tell you. And so I think it really goes into research informing not only clinical practice, but education around how we educate coaches and the athletes themselves, parents, other kind of community interested people that have some oversight into this. I think a big role as athletic trainers, specifically being at the front lines, being integrated all of these different conversations, is to have the appropriate knowledge to educate people to say, this is a warning sign. I don't know what it means, but it's not normal. Therefore, here are some steps that we can take to help you get back on the right track before something like a bone stress injury occurred due to a lack of energy intake and outcome or output kind of balance.
Yeah, I appreciate that discussion about education. Athletic trainers were at the forefront of being able to educate our athletes, and I always say, educate our patients before they become our patients in a lot of situations. One of the things that I found really interesting about your paper was the population of interest. Can you discuss a little bit more about why flag football was selected as the sport to understand the consequences of menstrual dysfunction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think if you read this paper alone, it might be a little bit confusing. So I'll give a little bit more context. It's part of a larger parent study and an effort that we've undertaken over the last 3 years in partnership with the Denver Broncos Foundation, who's funded this work. Where we started with them was a conversation several years ago about their interest in understanding kind of the risk benefit of sport in adolescent athletes, female athletes specifically. And one of their kind of initiatives has been to try to understand if flag football could be a viable option for high school girls to participate in. But to their credit, they said, hey, we can set up all of these initiatives and things like that, but we need to work with a research group and have them independently verify kind of what are the trade-offs, right? With any new sport, I think we want to have a full picture of what that, with any sport, there is a cost of, or I guess a risk of injury potentially, or other adverse outcomes. But I think we all in this room and hopefully all the listeners truly believe that there are a ton of benefits to participating in organized sports. And so through that work that we kind of had this joint mission, what we wanted to do was understand holistically how over a season of participation in flag football, how girls kind of reported injuries, what types of injuries they had, how much exposure they had, what are the secondary consequences of either getting injured or participating in sport. And so we actually published a different paper that really it's in the Clinical Journal of Sport Medicine, that highlighted more on the epidemiological side, kind of the injury rate. What is the injury rate among flag football relative to other team sports in adolescent athletes? And so through that effort, we worked with our state high school sport association to work to kind of provide that evidence that led to the sanctioning of high school girls flag football as an official sport this last year. And I think that was a really cool kind of primary objective, because our goal, I think, along with the Broncos, was to provide more opportunity for girls to participate in team sports. And flag football is a kind of a team sport that allows the participation for a lot of different individuals. Football, boys, kind of full tackle football in high school, the teams are 60 to 80, 100 people deep, and they have, A team, B team, C team, or whatever. And they're able to allow a lot of boys to participate in one sport. And there's really very few kind of synonymous types of sports on the girls' side. And so while flag football is not a perfect equivalent, it at least provides another opportunity for girls to participate in sports. So that's the context of kind of the study. But I'm also a firm believer that any good study that you do should be very holistic in how you approach measurement and outcome, and how you try to design the study so that you can not only achieve that primary objective, but create some secondary outcomes that are clinically meaningful and allow you to study kind of the ways in which girls are functioning, not just from a injury risk or a mental health perspective, but more holistically. And so I'll give Dr. Meyers here and Dr. Armento all the credit in the world. We sat down at the start of the study and we said, hey, what are some other things that would be very interesting to investigate? And within this cohort of athletes, we said, well, we're going to have longitudinal data throughout the season on their mental health and wellness that they rate each week. Let's ask about menstrual dysfunction. So we came up with some pre-planned kind of criteria that would at least feasibly allow us to understand this and then measure that over the rest of the time. So it's a long-winded answer to say it's a convenience sample of female adolescents. And since then, we've actually been able to grow this into a bigger study that, I think a lot of other researchers right now, it's August. And so we're all doing preseason testing and things like that. And so it's been able to grow into a more holistic female adolescent athlete study, not just flag football. But that's really where we started.
I appreciate you sharing that context. It's always exciting to hear about those robust collaborations like you expressed, and also the intentionality to ensure that there's this whole person approach when you're thinking about working with these different populations.
Yeah, and this wouldn't happen without the support of the Broncos Foundation. But to their credit, they were very thoughtful about partnering with us in a way that said, here's our goal, but we also recognize that we're not researchers. We want to empower you as researchers to do your thing. So they've been very independent, but also very supportive of the work that we're doing. And I think it's nice when you and a foundation board for a pro sports team, for example, share a very common vision and have a common purpose, but kind of each understand your unique strengths and abilities to execute those things and work in tandem. So it's been very fruitful, and we're really excited about not only this, but all the work that's forthcoming from this effort.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful collaboration and partnership you have.
Yeah.
So when thinking about the study itself, what all did you find? What were some of the differences in lifestyle factors between those who had menstrual dysfunction compared to those without menstrual dysfunction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually didn't find too many differences specifically with lifestyle factors between those who had menstrual dysfunction and those who didn't. So the hours of flag football participation actually didn't really matter significantly between the two groups. We didn't really find any differences between, those who were younger or those who were a little bit older. We didn't really find anything with BMI. And previous literature has found, those who participate in lean sports might be at higher risk for menstrual dysfunction. Those sports like gymnastics and running and climbing and wrestling that kind of put a lot of focus and emphasis on body image. A lot of the research has shown that the younger population, so around ages 15 to 24, are at higher risk. Those who have a lot of training volume, who are just doing a ton of physical activity, and then especially those athletes who just aren't fueling themselves properly. They're not getting enough calories in, especially for all the amount of physical activity that they're doing.
And when looking at the paper, I saw that there were some of those differences with the sleep and stress, but not necessarily mood and energy. Can you elaborate on potentially why those differences may or may not have existed?
Yeah, great question. I have a lot of theories. I don't have a ton of evidence for the why other than what we reported. And I think it becomes hard, right? So the way that we designed this study was we had kind of this prospective cohort design where we enrolled a group of adolescent female athletes at baseline, again, during the preseason evaluation. And then we followed them. They filled out weekly surveys throughout the season. So I think that number one, it's a strength because it's longitudinal and we kind of get an understanding of how they're perceiving their kind of dated or I guess week to week fluctuations. But in order to make this kind of I would say a more feasible, reasonable study, we couldn't ask a full survey of, 7 different, 30 item surveys every single week because we're going to lose people just by way of survey fatigue. So we had to find a balance of what questions do we ask? And really, again, the primary objective here was to ask about injuries and exposure to injuries and things like that. So we have this 0 to 10 sliding scale, which is essentially a visual analog scale that they just, for these 4 different domains, we asked in the last week, how's your sleep, stress, mood, and energy? And I think there are pluses and minuses to that approach, right? So it's a valid approach. It's something that people use all the time, but it's not the most in-depth approach. And we also averaged the kind of reported ratings across the entire season. So we're kind of trying to get a picture of, on average, during a season of participation in flag football, how are different each of these different elements being rated, which mitigates our ability to understand the week to week variability in just, life circumstances, right? Did you get injured? Are you tired? Did your, family have a fight, or your boyfriend, or, whatever it is? These are the things that might also influence some of these things. So in many ways, it's limited in our ability to understand yes, no definitively. But I think so the sleep and the stress, I think, are a little bit more tied to some of the concepts around the reasons, the root causes of menstrual dysfunction, which would be, as Rachel mentioned, improper fueling, too much physical activity, being kind of in this chronic state of, I don't have enough time, therefore it's going to come at the cost of sleep. And now that becomes more stressful because there's only so many hours in a day. I've got this much on sports and school and homework. What's the first thing to go? It's usually sleep. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is kind of diving into that, sleep being the kind of the great common denominator of pretty much every outcome, but also bidirectionally associated with everything. We can't really understand cause and effect. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now, but found that, again, that those same root causes potentially may be at play for why we see differences. On the mood and the energy, why we didn't find a difference there, I think really, as we've talked about this as a research group, in our previous publication, the primary one that I mentioned that was published in CJSM earlier this year as well, we found that the flag football cohort reported higher energy levels compared to non-athlete controls during the season. So there was also another group of non-athlete controls that weren't a part of this study. And I think that there's something that I can't really describe. And again, I'm trying to be my best research scientist, quantifiable guy here. But like, there's an energizing effect about being around other people and having a common goal that I think you get with team sports that you might not get if you're not participating in that. And so because of that, in addition to everyone in this study of the athlete group reporting more physical activity than the recommended amount, 150 minutes of exercise per week, all of those things are probably benefiting both mood and energy, creating kind of a ceiling effect on this 0 to 10 scale at the expense of potentially other things like sleep and stress that maybe aren't as positively affected by sport. So again, with sport, right, like there are so many trade-offs of costs and benefits, and we can't pretend to understand all of this in a single study. But I think we're trying to parse apart kind of all of the different potential ways in which they are associated. And that's going to drive kind of policy, education initiatives, and hopefully some interventions based on screening practices moving forward. So again, long-winded answer to say, I don't really know.
What I did hear, though, is that there's this interconnectedness between these different lifestyle factors, and it's challenging to try and measure these in isolation and see some differences or see lack of differences because of the interplay between each of these factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think as researchers, like this is our task, right? Is to try to, through a series of studies or a group of studies across researchers across the world, or at least across the country, to try to parse apart these things, build on each other's knowledge, and move forward from there.
So where do we go next? What's next steps in this space when we're thinking about maybe clinical practice or research when thinking about menstrual dysfunction and lifestyle factors?
That is the greatest question. The first thing is just talk about it. I think stop making this a taboo topic. Like, I think everyone needs to bring this up, ask their patients about this. The other thing is we need to screen for this early. I think not only should these questions be in every intake form in clinics, but I also think that some of these questions should be a part of preseason sports physicals. Because if we can screen for this early, then we can catch all of this stuff before they actually come to our clinics. And we can promote better health and wellness and overall quality of life for these girls. So I think the biggest thing is just we need to be comfortable asking these questions, and we need to screen for this really early.
Yeah, to build on that, I'll be the token guy with a beard I'm here to talk about menstrual function and its importance in athletes, right? Like, I want to be somebody who talks about it in the context of like, this is biology, and it's okay to talk about. I think to Rachel's point, it's been largely taboo. And I think if you look at some of the literature on just like who screens for relative energy deficiency syndrome or who screens for menstrual dysfunction, it's usually pediatricians or family med doctors who are, or sports medicine doctors who are female, not male. And so I'm fortunate that I get to work with a wonderful group of individuals who are very thoughtful about how we discuss this. And again, I think it's okay for guys to talk about this, right? So let's be a little bit more realistic in our language around our biological function and the way in which our body is intended to work. And if it's not working, recognize that and have a path forward for us to understand how we fix that so that we don't develop long-term problems in bone health or mental health or whatever poor outcome it is. I've given enough talks over the years at various conferences where I come up and I'm like, hey, I found an association. I found a difference. And I'm like so excited about it. And then I kind of leave it there. And then the clinicians come up to me and they're like, David, like, I have no idea. Like, cool. Like, great. You found a difference. You found a p-value that is below 0.05. How do I actually what's the so what about that? And that's really, I think, where we're going with this is to try to understand not only how do you screen, not only what are the consequences, but for those people who screen positive for menstrual dysfunction or at risk of low energy availability or at risk of a poor mental health outcome, how do we create pathways to help guide them into ways to educate so that they can help themselves avoid poor outcomes moving forward?
Well, I certainly appreciate you both being such advocates and champions for this research space and for clinical practice and enhancing screening and education about menstrual dysfunction. Just to wrap up with our last question, my favorite question to ask all of our guests, can you provide a take-home point about your paper for our listeners?
I think as David mentioned earlier, this is a vital sign. And I think we have to recognize it as it. And I think clinicians should feel comfortable asking for this. And, I think the biggest takeaway is just talk about it. Just don't let it be taboo. And I think that's going to affect and change so many girls' lives ahead if you just talk about it.
Could not agree more. Yeah. I think, especially in the athletic training context, right? I think, as mentioned earlier, athletic trainers are at a very unique and beneficial position to educate athletes. And I think empowering athletes to be their own champion and advocates and working alongside them to understand the problems that they're dealing with in this context or in any, I really think that that's the value of athletic training as a profession in this context, to really work with both athletes and coaches and kind of bridge what is necessary, what is needed, and kind of where you go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And thank you so much for joining me today. This article is available free of charge by the Journal of Athletic Training. I highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript in the journal. Again, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.